or afternoon or evening. Today is Tuesday, April 23rd, and we are going to finish up chapter 22. Once we finish the slides, I'll show you guys the review activity that we did in class today, and it's really going to help you. It will prepare you completely for writing the SAQ that will be your chapter quiz for chapter 22. And you'll also get to do that in the comfort of your own home and bring it back to me finished, hopefully in its final form. So this should be a really great opportunity for you guys to get some assessment points to boost your grade. You also can come in during office hours and ask me questions about the prompt or show me first drafts. Is this good enough? Will it get me my points that I need? And I can give you some feedback. So come on by. All right, chapter 22. Today we're going to go over the role of Islam in Turkey and Iran. And the bigger conversation around this involves all the nations of the global south. How much of their older traditions should they keep, and how much should they change their outlooks to a more modern and Western viewpoint? So if the ultimate goal is to compete globally, does that mean that you have to follow the Western way completely, partially, or not at all? So when we look at Africa, for instance, it's a case of African medicine men versus more modern hospitals. Is there a way to bridge that gap and use both in their medical system? In East Asia, it's Confucian-based family values versus urban and commercial growth. So how much should women be able to get these microloans and start these small businesses, for instance, and gain some economic independence? So today we are going to focus on Turkey and Iran, and we will start with Turkey. So Turkey is going to emerge as a republic from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. We know that after World War I, the Ottoman Empire disintegrates. We'll see a general from World War I, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. He's going to fight off British, French, Italian, and Greek efforts to take what was left of the empire in forming this Republic of Turkey. And in his opinion, to become modern was to enter European civilization completely. And this would involve, in the Muslim world, a question of, well, what do we do about Islam? How involved should Islam be in the state if we're trying to enter European civilization? So Ataturk's point of view was to totally remove Islam from public life. This doesn't mean that people were not Muslims. In their personal lives, in their private realm of the home, that could be very sacred. However, Ataturk is saying, for our state, we need to remove Islam politically as an influence. So there are several things that he did. First of all, he translated the Quran, the holy book of Islam, into Turkish, and the call to prayer began to be issued in Turkish. Of course, moving away from Arabic, which is traditional. The Sultan was deposed, the Caliphate was abolished, and we see Sufi organizations, tombs, and schools being closed down and outlawed. A number of religious titles were abolished. Again, there's an emphasis on removing the influence of Islam from state matters. Islamic courts were dissolved, and we see the Sharia being replaced with a secular law code. Now remember that Sharia was the law code that tied together state law and civic and religious law all as one. And so we see that being replaced by a secular law code without religious influence. Arabic script to write the Turkish language was now exchanged for a Western style alphabet to write the Turkish language. So again, removing that Arabic influence. Another change that Ataturk made was in appearance. So Turkish men had to abandon wearing the fez, a more traditional hat that was worn in Turkey. You can see it in the picture there on the screen. So Turkish men were not supposed to wear the fez anymore, and instead they were supposed to wear more Western style brimmed hats. And I'll show you a picture of that on the next slide. So here's a quote from Ataturk. "A civilized international dress is worthy and appropriate for our nation, and we will wear it. Boots or shoes on our feet, trousers on our legs, shirt and tie, jacket and waistcoat, and of course, to complete these, a cover with a brim on our heads." And we can see that on the next slide. So there's Ataturk in both of these pictures, actually, but we see him with this new brimmed hat in opposition to the earlier, more traditional fez. Ataturk also abolishes polygamy, taking more than one wife, and women would receive equal rights in divorce, inheritance, and child custody. In fact, Turkish women gained the right to vote a full decade before French women, before a European nation. So I think that that's pretty interesting and pretty significant to remember that in 1934, Turkish women gained the right to vote 10 years before French women did. Public beaches were also open to women. And we see this state-directed feminism. In other words, we see females getting more individual rights as mandated by the state. Here's another quote by Ataturk. "If henceforward the women do not share in the social life of the nation, we shall never attain to our full development. We shall remain irredeemably backward, incapable of treating on equal terms with the civilizations of the West." In other words, he's saying if we don't give our women in Turkey certain rights, certain individualistic rights, then we're not going to advance at the same rate as Western nations. Here we see another picture of Ataturk, again the founder of modern Turkey, and he often appeared in public in very elegant European dress. And this symbolizes visually a break with traditional Islamic ways of living. And here he's dancing with his adopted daughter at her high society wedding. So if it were not for me telling you that this is Ataturk and his daughter in Turkey, then we might just assume it's somewhere in the Western world based on their dresses and their suits. So Turkey moving toward a secular state and away from a more sacred state that's tied to Islam, he's going to get a lot of opposition from many in the Islamic world. And after his death in 1938, even in Turkey, some of his reforms were watered down or taken away. The call to prayer returned to Arabic in 1950. Since 2002, a moderate Islamic party has governed. In 2010, women were no longer prohibited to wear headscarves in universities. However, that watering down taken into account, even so, Turkey still the most secular and Western-oriented country of the region of the Middle East. And so if we're looking for an example of a Muslim nation that has westernized the most in their development, in their as far as their state, has influence in their state, then we want to remember the example of Ataturk in Turkey in his attempts to westernize the nation. Okay, so again, here we have a map. Shows Iran, which is our next example that we're going to look at, Turkey, and of course the overall Middle East. So among the contrasts, remember the Middle East is very diverse. We can't just put one label on the entire Middle East. One of the greatest contrasts has been between Turkey, again, the most secular, the most Western-oriented country of the region, and our next example that we'll look at, Iran. That is home to the most sustained Islamic revolution in the area. So lots of influence of Islam in Iran. So this is a case of contrasts here. So if we move on to Iran and we start talking about Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, we'll just call him Pahlavi for short, he ruled for unlimited for 3 decades, from 1941 to 1979. And he had a lot of wealth in oil, so that was a resource that Iran was very rich in. And he solidified his authority due to revenues from this agreement between Iran and Western oil companies. And so he's profiting from this arrangement, this relationship between Iran and the Western oil companies. He uses that money to build up the Iranian army. And so there's this emphasis on creating a powerful military. There's a well-educated elite. And again, this is a solid United States alliance because of the United States' interest in oil. We see a white revolution under Pahlavi's rule. Land was redistributed to many of the peasants. Women were granted the right to vote. We see investments made in healthcare and education, an increase in industrial projects, offering workers a share of the profits. So we see that there's a lot of Western influence culturally under Pahlavi. This relationship has influence. There's going to be resentment to this. Small-scale merchants were threatened by the influx of Western goods. The ulama, the religious scholars, were offended by state control of religious institutions and secular education programs. The educational professionals were disturbed that Iran had to rely so much on this outside influence, particularly a Western outside influence. And rural migrants are just facing rising costs and unemployment. And so technically, under Pahlavi, this was a constitutional monarchy. However, he ruled very autocratically. He has a lot of authority. Again, that money from the agreement between Iran and the West absolutely gave him some resources to build up the army. And he also ruled with his secret police. And the secret police used threats, intimidation, and violence to anyone who opposed his rule. So although this was technically a constitutional monarchy, he ruled in much more of an authoritarian fashion. So we start to see this opposition develop in Iran. The Shia religious leaders mobilized and they called for the Shah's removal. And the leader of this movement was a high-ranking Shia cleric, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and we'll call him Khomeini. Now, Ayatollah wasn't part of his name, it was his title, and that just meant that he was a leading Shia scholar. Now, Khomeini had been in exile for many years because he had protested against this pro-Western Shah, against Pahlavi. But upon his return, he leads this opposition movement. He returned in 1979, and we saw a lot of support for Khomeini versus very little support for the Shah. The support for the Shah is eroding, and the Shah abdicates the throne, and he left the country. He left Iran with his wife. So we can see differences in their approaches just based in their appearance. One looks more traditionally Muslim. We see Khomeini at the bottom, and we see Pahlavi, who is dressed much more like a Western-inspired military leader. All right, so continuing to talk about Khomeini, he is going to form the world's first Islamic republic. There was an elected parliament and a constitution, but in practice, they were dominated by conservative Islamic clerics, again, headed by Khomeini. And there was a council of guardians. These were leading legal scholars. They interpreted the Constitution, they supervised the elections, they reviewed the legislation, all to make sure that it was compatible with their particular vision of Islam. So when we say that there's an elected parliament and a constitution and there's elections, however, on the other hand, these elections are supervised, and we have this group of legal and religious scholars who are going over the terms of the Constitution and the laws to make sure they're compatible with this one view of Islam. It's more complicated than saying that it's just, a republic with a parliament and a constitution. We see opposition being crushed. There were 1,800 executions in 1981 for those, quote, waging war against God, end quote. And in other words, they're executing anyone who opposes Khomeini and the Council of Guardians. So Khomeini believed that the purpose of government was to apply the law of Allah as expressed in Sharia. So in Turkey, where we saw them moving away from the Sharia toward a secular law code, here in Iran, they are using the Sharia in what they view as the most fundamental and pure form. The judges all had to be competent in Islamic law. Any other judge would be dismissed. In June of 1980, 200 universities and colleges were closed for 2 years so that they could, quote, purify textbooks, curricula, and faculty of un-Islamic influences. So that involved getting rid of textbooks that they felt were not traditional enough, writing new textbooks potentially, getting rid of faculty members who didn't fit in this view of Islam in the colleges and universities. Elementary and secondary schools gave priority to religious instruction in the teaching of Arabic. And in the elementary and secondary school level, we see teachers losing their jobs as well. 40,000 lost their jobs because they weren't considered pious enough. Pre-Islamic Persian literature fell out of favor. Instead, we see the history of Islam, and Iran's revolution is going to take a dominant role in schools and mass media. Western loan words, or words that had more of a Western origin, were purged from Farsi and they were replaced with Arabic equivalents. So again, trying to get rid of the Western influence. Women were required to wear the head covering, the hijab, and that was enforced by revolutionary guards. This often included harassment, lashings, sometimes imprisonment. So whereas in Turkey, where we saw the public beaches open to women, in Iran, we see sexual segregation, not just on the beaches, but also in schools and parks and public transportation. The legal marriage age for girls under Pahlavi, the age was 18, so the more Western influenced Pahlavi. When Khomeini takes power, the legal marriage age for girls was reduced to 9 years old with parental consent, and 13, later on 15, without parental consent. So that means if you were a 9-year-old girl in Iran at this time, and your parents said that you were going to get married to this much older individual, then that was legal, even if you objected, even if you refused. And at 13, if there was no parental consent, then that was the minimum age for marriage. Even so, many women supported the revolution. There were greater opportunities for employment and higher education. 60% of university students were women, and women could still vote. So Khomeini wanted to export their model of this Islamic state to other areas, other regions in the Middle East, and they offered some training opportunities and to these oppositional movements in Lebanon, Syria, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. And again, he's going to appeal to Shia minorities because Iran was Shia Islam. This attempt to spread their model abroad in part leads to an 8-year war with Saddam Hussein's highly secularized Iraq. So again, if we say secularized, that means the state is apart from the religion. So this became a case of the Arabs versus the Persians, Sunni versus Shia, a secular regime versus an Islamic government in Iran. In 1989, we see the death of Khomeini. Some elements of his program ease up a bit. Women's dress code was not so stringent. We see a more moderate government in 1997. In 2005, we have some conservative elements returning. 2009, we see some disputed elections revealing some opposition, which of course opposition would not have been safe under Khomeini. In 2013, we see more moderate leadership develop. Even so, this is an interesting side story, I think, to Khomeini's reign, and this was at the very, very end of it. On Valentine's Day in 1989, there was a fatwa issued against a novelist. and the novelist's name is Salman Rushdie, and he had written a book called The Satanic Verses. And this fatwa issued by Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran, it was an international call to all Muslims to kill this novelist, to kill Rushdie. And so he had this hit out on him that, again, all Muslims are being encouraged to take this guy out. And the reason for this was that the book was considered blasphemous. It was considered anti-Islam. And the reward for anyone who was able to kill Rushdie was $1 million, and that was the initial, but it would rise in value. British security forces, which is where Rushdie lived, he lived in Britain, he had to be placed into hiding. He had to stay there for the next 9 years of his life. He had to have around-the-clock police protection. He did resurface, sort of, publicly in 1998, but the Salman Rushdie fatwa, to my knowledge, remains in place to this day, just because he wrote this novel, The Satanic Verses, that was considered blasphemous to the Ayatollah. So just an interesting sort of side story to Khomeini's reign. And again, in Iran, the oil reserves funds their development. They're actively pursuing nuclear power, perhaps nuclear weapons. And so there is tension, obviously, between Iran and the West and in other nations as well. This picture here shows women and the Iranian Revolution. So we see the Ayatollah there on the screen, Khomeini, and one of the goals of the Islamic Revolution, again, was to enforce a more modest and traditional dress code for the country's women. So this is from 2004, and we see a woman clad in, I'm so sorry if I pronounce this wrong, it's either chador or kador, and so we see that she has a more traditional covering as clothing, and she's talking on her cell phone. So it's an interesting juxtaposition between tradition, and we do see the effects of globalization and modernization. I mean, she's talking on a cell phone. And finally, the last slide shows the Shiite population in the Middle East. And so the darker green areas, the darker the green, the higher the Shia population of Muslims. And we see, of course, Iran there with the highest, 90 to 95%. And the other regions in green, we can assume are either Sunni or Sufi. There would be tension between the groups, the nations that have a high Shia population and those who have a low Shia population. And we're going to pause here for just a moment. You guys will need to get out a piece of paper. We're going to set up a review activity for this chapter that will really help to prepare you for that SAQ for chapter 22. See your chapter 22 decolonization SAQ prompt. You need to turn this in finished by Friday, by the end of the day. So if I see you 8th period, you can turn it in then. If I don't see you because of the Aspire testing, just come by anytime that day before 3:45 and just put it in the turn-in box. And if we look at the SAQ together, it says, using the list below in your knowledge of world history, answer parts A, B, and C. So you have a list of places that include India, South Africa, Latin America, Turkey, and Iran. And those are exactly the places that we focused on in our chapter 22 PowerPoint. So A says, using the list above, explain one example of common ideals that inspired the anti-colonialist leaders and organizations in their movements for independence and decolonization. So you need to figure out one thing that ideologically they all have in common. Secondly, using at least two of the above regions, explain one difference in ideals that inspired the anti-colonialist leaders and organizations in their movements for independence and decolonization. So you're going to pick two from that list that have a significant difference in their ideals, and you will talk about that difference. Part C, using at least 2 of the above regions, explain one different political effect of the decolonization process. So politically, something that involves, politics or laws or state building, or it could be boundaries. Using at least 2 of the above, explain one different political effect of the decolonization process. So this will be your quiz for Chapter 22. It will be assessment points. And in getting ready for that quiz, this is what I personally would do. I would set up a foldable for myself. It's a note taker that just helps to very succinctly summarize the important things about each of those regions. So you can see the very fuzzy, blurry image of the foldable above. Hopefully you'll be able to read that, but this is how you would set it up. So on one side, you're going to write Turkey, Iran, and then decolonization. That decolonization column, that's your cover for this foldable. On the other side of the paper, you'll write India, South Africa, and Latin America. And in all of these, you're going to be looking at what were they like before independence, who were the nationalist leaders and organizations, what are the conflicts both within the movement itself and without, so external and internal conflicts. And finally, what are the outcomes? What did independence look like in each of these regions? So I will leave you to it. If you do this foldable, it will really help you in constructing your SAQ. As far as what to turn in from Chapter 22, I need your fully completed study guide, the usual note taker we use, and your SAQ response. So I don't necessarily need your foldable, but again, if you really want to have a good study tool in preparing for this SAQ, I would suggest making one. All right, that is it for Chapter 22. Turn in your study guides and your completed SAQs by this Friday. And tomorrow we will move on to our very last chapter, Chapter 23, on globalization.